out of all the crazy things that happened this year, I think talking to 100 or so teachers about the NAIRU might be the craziest. I'm really delighted to talk about it because it is super confusing and something that I enjoy teaching, but also struggle in terms of the student's perspective. In terms of my presentation, all of these slides, I'm very happy to share and we can organize that afterwards. There are 3 things that I'd like to leave you with in terms of the presentation. The first thing is to truly narrow the focus. The second thing is to focus on applying the knowledge. And the third thing is to focus on giving students feedback on how they're talking about the NAIRU. In terms of when I've taught the NAIRU, that it seems to be in terms of what students want to know, but then what students need to know. And in terms of what students want to know, I find that either they want to know everything and they would like to be kind of Nobel Prize economist level knowledge on the NAIRU, or they want absolutely nothing to do with it. And I can empathize with both perspectives, really. The other thing I find a lot of is that students will come to me and say, my friend who is at this school, their teacher said that the NAIRU, you have to say this, you have to show this. So there's a lot of knowledge that students think they need to know. But then I think that there are 3 things that students really have to know in terms of what could be assessed in the HSC. One thing is a simple definition of what the NAIRU is, what happens above, below, and at the NAIRU, and then the appropriate policy responses based on where we are at the NAIRU. When I narrowed my focus in terms of talking about the NAIRU and teaching it, I found it very helpful because it shrunk the amount of things that I was trying to convey to students and what they needed to take on board as well. I sort of look at it really about putting things simply, and that it's very much a focus on, if students get asked this, what are the core things, non-negotiables that they have to know to be able to succeed? And for me, it comes back to what James was saying before, is that thinking about the NAIRU is the level of unemployment where there is no cyclical unemployment, right? If students get that bit of information, it is so helpful in then building the other elements. If we look at things like the Phillips curve and the unemployment gap, I say hold that, right? Leave that till much later, because that stuff is more tricky. And that if I can get students to have this foundational understanding that when I see NAIRU, I think this, that they're on the right track in terms of applying the knowledge. If I think about it a little bit more in detail, there are 2 things that I absolutely have to have students understand at the start. One, the NAIRU is where cyclical unemployment equals 0. Right? This is just a foundational piece of knowledge. It's not something we need to argue about. We can discuss it, but that this is part of the understanding. And that, as James was saying, that full employment is a situation where there is no cyclical unemployment. And we can go around in the classroom and talk about this and sort that out. But that's one core bit of information. The other thing is the idea of why do we care about the NAIRU as HSC economics students? And that if I'm trying to answer that question, I'm saying to them, the NAIRU tells us what policy setting we should use for the economy. So when I'm trying to teach students, I'm not going to move on until I feel like they have these 2 fundamental bits of information, and that it can be just conveyed in terms of, this is one, this is what it means, this is the other, this is what it means. So that when I then take it a step further, I feel like we're okay with that material, or okay enough, that the next thing is I want to apply this knowledge. And that the reason that I suggest this is that there is a very clear pattern in the way that NAIRU questions are asked in the HSC. You would have seen it last week in the paper, another, sort of very typical example of the way they are asked. And that I'm not preparing students to write an entire essay about the NAIRU. I'm just not, it's not cost benefit, it would be a waste of time. Instead, I'm thinking about how are they going to be asked to apply this information so that what often happens is that I get students that come up to me and say, can you read over my notes, particularly about something like the NAIRU? And my universal response is no, I'm not interested in reading over your notes. What I want you to do is I want you to answer question 23C. And that the reason that I say that is that the way that the questions seem to be asked in the HSC follow a particular pattern in the sense that, okay, you need to know what the NAIRU is, but then you need to know what the government should do, right, in terms of what the situation is. And that the reason that I say no to reading over their notes is that if they can't answer a question like 23C, which comes from the 2015 HSC, then I know that foundational knowledge isn't there and we should spend more time, I should spend more time with the student talking about where are they going wrong? Where are they making the mistake here? But for me, it's like, it's a real focus on at every opportunity to try and apply their knowledge to the questions that are likely asked. And I think that this one is a really good one in terms of being able to apply the knowledge in the way that it does seem to be examined. Another great example are multiple choice questions. I spend a lot of time with multiple choice questions, using them in all sorts of different ways. What I might do with a question like this, which comes from last year's HSC, is I might cut out of the question everything under that yellow box. And I would give them just that information and say, if it is operating at this, what do we know about this economy? What do we know about the possible policy options that an economy like this has? Because what I also find is that students will zoom through the text in the question and jump to the answer categories. And that if I can take away the answer categories and we can go back and say, when you see NAIRU, what are the things you need to think about? Okay, great. Cyclical unemployment equals 0. Good. We're at full employment. Okay, great. And then what are the policy options that we should do? Well, it depends on what the government's trying to achieve. But I want all those things to happen before they start getting into the actual answer categories and the options in terms of what they need to provide. That I want them to make that really quick and easy connection when they see the NAIRU. Here are the fundamental bits of knowledge that I need to be thinking about. In terms of what I would use as resources to test the policy response part of things, or to discuss the policy response part of things is probably a better way of explaining it, is that in the RBA's very excellent explainer on the NAIRU, they have this really great graph. I've added the A and B just for my purposes, but I think that a graph like this is a really great jumping off point. I might even take off the unemployment rate stuff at the top, just at the start, just not to introduce another new thing before we go through it. And to just look at what this graph is showing in terms of the unemployment rate, in terms of the NAIRU, and then also in terms of inflation. So if I've got a graph like this, what I'm thinking in terms of my teaching is I'm like, okay, what do I need them to be able to answer to understand this in terms of what the NAIRU means? And then also, what should we do at each of these points? So that if I think about a graph like this, this is such an excellent resource, such a small but excellent resource in terms of trying to get students to understand, that I thought about what would be sort of like 4 key things that they would need to answer in terms of showing that they understand this. And that the kind of things that I ask students are, what is the relationship between unemployment and the NAIRU at point A and B? And that this is kind of showing me, do they understand, the types of unemployment that are present? Because that leads into that next question that I say, okay, so let's be at point A, what types of unemployment are present? And that it's really getting them to be able to create a list and say, at A, here are all the types of unemployment that are present, with the key thing being able to say, that this is what is happening here. And then at B, what types are present or absent. It may feel like a kind of duplicated effort, but I'm really trying to get them at every step to think about the relationship between unemployment, inflation, and the level of the NAIRU. And that leads into the next point, is that we're saying what would happen to inflation pressures at A and B? And they would say, okay, well, the graph says lower inflation. And you say, okay, well done. You read the graph. I'm really happy for you. What is your explanation as to why that is the case? What is it that is happening that means there is downward pressure on prices, or at least not upward pressure on prices? And then the key part here is what could be policy responses at A and B, and looking at it in terms of the types of goals that a government or central bank might be looking at. What would be the things that they would be doing in terms of those contexts? So that I'm trying to keep it very targeted, that if I go back a little bit, that I'm really trying to come back to these things as often as I can, is to really be thinking, okay, let's remind ourselves this is what the NAIRU is, and then this is what we're going to use it for, that it's kind of like this indicator or signal that in order to do X, we should be looking at Y. That's really the kind of approach that I'm looking at in terms of this. If we scroll a little bit forward, the other thing which I think is extremely important, and not just in the NAIRU, but what I've found a lot of value in, is giving students responses to mark themselves. And particularly around something at the NAIRU, I think it's really interesting for them to see how other students are actually trying to articulate it in that written format, because they might be pretty cluey in terms of talking about it verbally in class, but when they have to put their ideas down on paper, I think that that can be a challenge. Not just I think, I have seen that be a challenge. So I do a combination of a couple of things, particularly around the NAIRU. The first thing that I find is useful is the sample answers from NESA themselves, because the sample answers I find are not like the best of the best answers. They're sort of like they tick the boxes and they are okay. So that for me, it's an opportunity for the students to read kind of like what would be a base level, sort of good answer, and then asking them, what are the things that you would add on here? What are the additional items that you think might take this from a good response to a really excellent response? The second thing is that I get them to share their responses with each other, which is not a very unique practice in terms of what I do, but is useful. But I think that the most useful thing that I have done is to write my own responses that are riddled with mistakes, particularly around something like the NAIRU. So I very deliberately get things confused and write things that are incorrect and ask them to go through it and to not just point out the things that are wrong, but to actually identify why they were wrong and the kind of feedback that they would give instead. And I think something like that is really good with the NAIRU, where it's a lot of, if this happens, then this should happen. And if you mix that up, then getting them to be like, no, 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 the real relationship should be this way, or the actions should be this way. So that I'm sort of trying to take it out of being something that is very abstract, difficult, impossible to hold concept into something that is very practical and applied. I think the other thing with some of these kind of issues in the syllabus is that it's really only examined with what, like a multiple choice question or a part of a short answer, or maybe in a paragraph in an essay. So that in terms of the mental effort that it takes, being like, okay, now we've got to teach the NAIRU, oh gosh, that in terms of what is actually examined is that those are not always equal. So that for me, again, and I know I'm pushing this point, but it's coming back to, can students get these two things and then apply that knowledge in terms of questions? That's really where I am coming from. So In terms of my approach, would I say this is successful? I think that there are lots of benefits in terms of these ideas, because when students then see NAIRU in the exam, that they will be circling that, putting arrows, being like, this is what it means, before they even get stuck into the question itself. And I think that's really helpful, because if they are stuck on the concept of the NAIRU and they not feeling comfortable in terms of whether they understand it clearly, it's very hard to get a great answer in those kind of contexts. So I didn't want to go too far else. Those are kind of the key things that I wanted to suggest. I know we'll have some time for questions, but I know I've given a fair amount of information in a short amount of time. So, please, there's a lot of ways to get in touch, and I'd be very happy to discuss further if there's anything that you want to clarify. So thank you very much.